Right. It's pretty much noon on the dot, I think. So we're going to go ahead and get started. First, I just want to say welcome. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know the weather wasn't great this morning, but this afternoon looks a little bit better. I'm Robin Clem. I'm the Outreach Archivist for the Georgia Archives. And our monthly Lunch and Learns are sponsored by the Friends of the Georgia Archives and History. So we always want to say a big thank you to FOGA. They have a new brochure, which is available on that back table, and there's a donation box back there as well. There's also a donation button on the georgiaarchives.org website. After this presentation, if you'd like to go down to our reference room and do some research or just take a look and see what we have on site, you're more than welcome to do that. If you'll just stop by the front desk and get a researcher's card, the card is good for 5 years and it's free, so take advantage of that. And then if you do have a researcher's card and you want to stop by the research room, please just stop by the front desk to check in as well. And we are so happy to have Miss Ruby J. Manley here today for our Lunch and Learn for August. Before we get started and I do an introduction for Miss Ruby and she'll do her presentation, we do want to give away our door prize, which is Georgia. So hopefully everybody's gotten a ticket.
Been chosen to pick a winner, so if you don't win, don't blame me. Matter of fact, I'm just going to be real impartial and close mine.
There you go. All right. So the winner is, let's see, it ends in 1831. 31.
831?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So this is Ruby J. Manley. She was born in Carrollton County. Carrollton, Georgia. She's completing research on Granny Midwives and maternal health care in Georgia. During the late 1960s, she was among the first African American students to attend the University of West Georgia, formerly known as West Georgia College. Miss Manley embraced a 30-year career with the Georgia state government, where she was employed by the Fulton County Department of Family and Children's Services. She holds an associate's degree in urban studies, a bachelor's degree of social work, and a master's degree in African American studies. She is also a doctoral candidate. She is scheduled to graduate in the spring of 2024 with a PhD in history. Ms. Manley currently teaches African American history at Georgia State University. So if you will all please welcome Miss Ruby J. Manley with me.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm so glad to see each and every one of you. You made it in spite of the rain. First, I'd like to thank the wonderful staff of the Georgia State Archives. If you've never been here, you need to visit. It is a wonderful place, and you know what? You don't appreciate it until you get a chance to visit other state archives. For me, Georgia State Archives, and I guess I'm a little biased, it's state of the arts for me. It is not just above some of the other archives that I had the opportunity to visit over the summer. I've visited 4 Southern archives this summer. Georgia State is the Georgia Archives is the very best one. So please take advantage of what's here. It is history. And it's wonderful. I'm doing my research, the majority of it is here at the archives. So I just wanted to acknowledge them because they've been a very good source for my research. As a matter of fact, I could not find my sources that were relevant to midwifery at the other libraries. I searched the Atlanta Public Library, and they had a few articles. I searched the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and I was referred to the library over on the AU campus, where they didn't have the information that goes back to the beginning of where I wanted to start my research. But in trying to explore where I could get this information, I came across the State of Georgia Archives, and I looked at what they were offering, and I thought, this is where I need to be. And sure enough, it was where I needed to be. It was where I needed to find my information. Now, before we get into the history of maternal health care and the Granny Midwives here in Georgia, um, because that's what we hear about, I have not discovered any ways to deal with the maternal uh, mortality crisis among African American women. Have not done that. I will be glad when something happens to that effect because too many Black women are dying from childbirth. Childbirth is a natural process. So I'm going to go and show you a little bit about the maternity mortality rate, and then we're going to talk about the Granny Midwives. You see up on my slide, I've listed Louisiana, Georgia, and Alabama. Up until last year, 2022, Georgia led the nation in being the #1 state with the highest maternity mortality rates in the nation. They held that distinction for 10 years. They dropped to #2 last year, 2022. Louisiana is #1 now. Louisiana has a maternal mortality rate of, oh, I didn't put that there, but I'll give it to you. That rate currently is 58.1% of deaths. These are deaths of African American women based on 100,000 live births. Louisiana is #1. Georgia takes the #2 place. Our maternity rate in Georgia in 2022 was 48.6%. I listed Alabama because Alabama is much lower, and Alabama have never been in the ratings as one of the states with the top mortality rate. So currently, Alabama's rate is 36.7. Now, I'm doing research on Alabama and Georgia, and I'm comparing them. I'm trying to figure out why Georgia's rate was so high and Alabama's was so low, and they're sister states right here in the South. So that's part of what my research is, but those are the mortality rates. Now, the thing about mortality rates is that CDC and the World Health Organizations is kind of like overseers. And CDC has reported that many of the mortalities associated with African American women are incidents that could be prevented. Okay, let's see. Get to my next slide. These incidents, according to CDC, is excessive bleeding, hemorrhaging after childbirth. That can be prevented. It takes monitoring. And infections, a lot of times the mother may get infected because all of the placenta has not been expelled. Blood clots, those are preventable. Hypertensive disorders. And then you got cultural disengagement. And I listed that cultural disengagement because it go back to that old stereotype about African Americans being able to withstand more pain than whites. And a lot of times that doctor is ignoring that patient's complaint. Okay. How many of you familiar with Judge Hassett? TV Judge Hassett. Okay. You know her son's wife died from hemorrhaging. She bled out for 8 hours in the emergency room, and no one would come and attend to her, even though the father requested that they come and see about her. And when they finally did come, she had bled out in a catheter blood, and they rushed her to the emergency room. They did not tell him what was going on with her until she had passed. Serena Williams, she had complications with her childbirth, and she's a top-notch athlete, and you know she knows her body. But the physicians ignored her complaint that she didn't feel right. And that, of course, go back to that cultural disengagement. A lot of the doctors feel like Black women are just complainers, or they don't know what they're talking about. Even in some of the visits, doctor visits, when an African American patient would complain about how they're feeling like I'm having excessive headaches, or you, or I'm not able to keep food on my stomach. They just say, oh, well, those are just the symptoms. But if you know your body, you know when something is wrong with it. So a lot of that goes back to the cultural disengagement that has plagued us, and that is also a source of the maternal mortality rates. These are things that could have been prevented. All right, now African Americans, women in Georgia, they're dying from childbirth. Uh, but this is not to say that the women in the other ethnicities are not dying. It's just that African American women are dying at a higher proportionate than the other ethnicities. Okay. In terms of looking at what's going on with these African American women, there's no correlation. These maternal mortality rates don't discriminate. If you are of a higher socioeconomic status, if you have education, if you are a doctor, you will die from childbirth in Georgia. Now, we know some of the things that's behind all of this. And these are women who know their bodies, who've taken all the precautions to make sure that they have safe deliveries, like watching their weight, watching their diets, going to prenatal conferences. They are doing all the right things, but they are dying. So we know it's not us, there's something wrong with the system. And I'm enough said about that. Now we're going to talk about the history of Granny Midwives. Okay. Let's look back at and let me get you to where you need to be. Let's look back at this slide. I listed in that first dot the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was involved captive Africans off the shore of West Africa, put aboard a slave ship, brought to America. When they got to America, they were sold, or they had to endure the harsh treatment of slavery. This was back in the 1700s. Fast forward back to 1807, the slave trade was banned. Okay, but all of the states in this great nation that we have, they didn't ban slave trade. A lot of that went on up until the Civil War. But let's go back and talk about slave trade. By 1850. By 1850, cotton had become king in the South. Before cotton became king in the South, you had crops of tobacco, indigo, and rice that was being cultivated South Carolina and up Virginia coast. But by 1850, cotton became king in the South. The slave trade was banned, which means you couldn't get any more free labor from Africa. So guess what? The domestic slave trade was created. The domestic slave trade was where owners or sellers would sell African Americans on the bordering states of the Mason-Dixie line. And they sold them, and they were placed in chain and brought to the South to work the cotton fields for free labor. Now, during this domestic slave trade, it created a plantation economy. In this plantation economy, the midwife was valuable. Okay? Midwives was valuable. As a matter of fact, she held a status higher than, sometimes equal or higher than the overseer. Everybody know what the overseer was. Everybody know what he did, right? Okay. Well, she occupied that status. And she occupied that status because she was valuable in delivering babies for her owner up in the big house. She delivered babies for her owner's wife. She delivered the babies in the slave quarters. And that was real important because at that time, blacks, the captives, Africans that were captive, they were chattel. Does everybody know what chattel is? Chattel is the part of slavery where African Americans were property. You had no rights of your body. You were a piece of property. If you go over here to the research area and you start looking up some of those documents, you'll see African Americans listed as a number, like Negro 1, Negro 2. They had no rights over their bodies. They were property like the pliers, the horses, the cows, the buildings on the property. They were property. And the owner had the right to do what he wanted to with them. Now, during this domestic slave trade, women, African American women, became breeders, which compensated for there not being African Americans brought in because slave trade was banned. So they became breeders. The breeders were the women who had strong, bustling men to do the field work on the plantation. The owner decided who the woman would mate with, and they chose the biggest, strongest looking male for them to mate with. They had no say as to whether they wanted to be with this person or not. They were breeded, kind of like you do livestock. You know, you got a prize bull, you're going to put him with the prize heifer. So this is what was going on. Now, they needed the midwives to deliver these babies because strong Black bodies kept the cotton economy going. It kept the South going. So those midwives were valued. They delivered the babies. They became a source of income for their owners because they were hired out as well for the neighboring plantations. Some of those plantations maybe did not have medical services for their slaves, so for the enslaved rather. So they were hired out to work on other plantations. Midwives didn't get paid for that. Their owner got the money. So they were hired out. Not only did they deliver the babies for the enslaved, for their masters, for their neighbor's plantation, they helped deliver the livestock. So a midwife had a lot. She had a lot on her plate. Okay. Now, this happened up until the Civil War. Civil War freed the enslaved. A lot of the enslaved left those plantations. I mean, they left at night. They were running. I don't blame them. They left. A lot of them went to the urban areas, and a lot of them had to stay on the plantation. During that time between the Civil War and when we get down to this progressive era, we had Reconstruction in between that. And that was where the Civil War had freed African Americans, but there was a fraction in the South who wanted to keep Africans enslaved. And they did all they could to reverse the political gains during Reconstruction. Okay. After that Reconstruction era, that came the era, the most inhumane era in the South, where treatment of Blacks in terms of lynching for no reason occurred. And that was called the Jim Crow South. So anytime you hear somebody refer to Jim Crow, they're talking about that heinous part of African American history where Blacks were lynched for no reason. They were lynched because they were trying to advance. The ruling power in the South did not want that. They were still smarting from the Civil War that they lost. And I hope I'm not offending anybody, but it's just the truth. They did not want advancement for African American people. Now, progressive era came. That was around 1890 to 1920. Midwives were practicing independently of any kind of rules and regulation. They did what they knew best, which was delivering babies and trying to provide health care to an impoverished population. So they were doing what they needed to do. During that progressive era in America, and I get a little bit behind. Okay, we're all right here. Um, it was an era where there was social change, and it came right on the heels of the of World War II. There was social disorder, and the progressive era was an era that looked at social reform. They looked at corruption. You remember back in that area, in when they talked about prohibition, they attacked at that. They attacked the monopoly of large industries, textile industries, particularly, uh, that were discriminating or were using unscrupulous rules. So that's what that progressive era was about. Now, out of that progressive era, a group of Northern feminists start to look at the maternal mortality rate, as well as infants too. Infants was a part of this too. You know, if you got an infant, it dies, the mother dies. That's a rate. That's both the baby and the mother. But they began to look at that, and they came across the idea that the mortality rate was caused by midwives. They looked at midwives as being the cause of that rate because they said they were dirty and ignorant, didn't know what they were doing. But remember, these midwives brought that knowledge with them from across the ocean, from Africa. They had been doing it for centuries. And they were providing the health for their neighborhood, for their communities that were not able to access health care because Black people could not get health care from our hospitals. A lot of our doctors, they did not have access to that. But it was not only just the Black women, it was poor white women that could not get that help because they did not have the money to pay. Okay, so when these Northern women, they looked at the mortality rate, and they came up with the idea that it was the midwives that were causing it. Now, they were not the only ones. You had the American Medical Association, you had the doctors. They all said, okay, we know why these women are dying. The midwives are dirty, don't know what they're doing. So they came up with legislation, and they presented it to Janet Rankin, who was at that time the first woman to serve or even be elected into Congress. After they wrote up these laws and regulations, they presented it to Miss Rankin. She presented it on the floor of Congress, and Congress rejected it. 2 years later, Senator Morris and Senator Towner, hence your Shepherd-Towner Act, we'll get to that. They presented it, and President Warren G. Harding signed the Shepherd-Towner law into act, into the act to deal with maternal mortality and infant mortality. Now, what that Shepherd-Towner Act entailed was it was created to reduce the internal mortality rates. So they went after that mortality rate through that act. They created that act to establish health clinics for people in the South. Because the South was the area they targeted. They looked at the low-income areas, and one of those areas was the South, but they targeted African-American women and poor white women in terms of looking at this mortality rate. Okay. That act also provided for hiring physicians and nurses to educate and care for pregnant women, mothers, and their children. It provided for visiting nurses to educate and care for pregnant and new mothers. It provided federal funds to establish programs to educate people about prenatal health and infant welfare. It provided for midwifery training and licensing. And it also provided for the distribution of nutrition and hygienic information. Now, when this group of Northern feminists decided to tackle that high maternal mortality rate, they had no idea what the can of worms they opened. First of all, they didn't know what the complexities of the South were. Impoverished conditions. This was existing back in the early 1920s. Okay? I included the slide because the slide on the left is the house, it's a tenant house, because back at that time, most of the income that these families had was from sharecropping. How many know what sharecropping is? Okay, you know about sharecropping. It means that at the end of the year, you didn't have no money because you owed it all to the person who owned the land. And you had to stay another year, get deeper in debt, another year, deeper in debt. Okay. The image on the left is a black sharecropper's house. The image on the right is a white sharecropper's house. But there were extreme impoverished conditions. And I mentioned before, you had racism, white supremacy, Jim Crow. That was the law of the land in the South. It was Jim Crow. Do what we say or we're going to hang or shoot you. And there's a lot of violence that went on. If you had a chance to read Ida B. Wells' autobiography, she attacked these acts of violence and said that, in essence, they were really not acts based on what was reported. They were acts because these violent acts came from white supremacy groups that did not want to see African Americans excel. A lot of the claims was that these African American men were chasing after white women, but that was not the case. That was not the case. Ida B. Wells' closest friend in Tennessee was killed because he had a grocery store, and there were two grocery stores on each corner, the black grocery store and the white grocery store. And the black grocery store was getting more customers, and there was a jealousy going on. So you had a rivalry there, and it had to do with property and profits. Okay, but I'm not going to keep sprinkling African American history here because we're talking about midwives. Okay, you had those impoverished conditions. They was extremely rural, sharecroppers condition, sharecroppers era. There was no income, no money to spare. And if you look at this, you can see that when these Northern women start looking at this, they talked about sanitary conditions. They talked about running water. They talked about refrigeration of milk, because that was one of the things that they looked at, was there was no refrigeration in these houses. How can you? They didn't even own the houses, so you could not have refrigeration. Some of these houses didn't even have wells. They had to carry their water from streams and branches. Some of them did not even have outhouses. How many know what an outhouse is? Okay, some of these didn't have them. And of course, when you're using that kind of wherever you can squat and do what you need, you're going to get contamination because you got water runoff. Even if it runs into the streams, you still got contamination. Even the drinking water had to be transported from streams. Okay. Also, the South was financially devastated. And of course, I mentioned that they were still smarting after the Civil War. So, since this was a destitute area, there was no health care. The only health care provider was the Granny Midwives. And I mentioned that the doctors and the American Medical Association wanted to eliminate the Granny Midwives. Okay, well, I tell you what, it didn't happen. So let's talk about the Granny Midwives. Let's talk about who they were. They were older Black women, and they lived in the South. Now, when you get to the mountainous areas of North Georgia, these midwives were called granny ladies. And some of them were even called white witches and black witches. You know, there's a belief that midwives came from witchcraft, okay? But they were healers. A lot of the midwives were healers, okay? They passed their skills on generationally, which means if you had a grandmother that was a midwife, then she passed that skill on to her daughter. Then the daughter passed that skill on to her daughters. It was passed down generationally. These are skills that were brought from Africa, and they continue to pass them down. No written record, oral history. These traditions were passed down. They were skilled in herb medicine. They were skilled in childbirth delivery. They were skilled in healing. They were spiritual. These women believed in God, and they believed they were called to do this mission, the mission of delivering babies. A lot of them recall in my search, I came across a lot of them recall being called to do this. They have been out in the field chopping or picking cotton, and they heard a voice to tell them that this is what you need to do. That was their calling. They believed that a voice from the Lord instructed them to do this, and they held on to that belief. Okay. Like I said, with this situation going on, the midwives held the knowledge. They were the gatekeepers of the knowledge on childbirth because medicine had not advanced that far. And a lot of these doctors did not know about gynecology or obstetrics. And a lot of times, because of the modesty of the female body, white female body, a lot of the doctors examined their patients with a sheet over their head, over the woman's knees, and a sheet over their head. So they wouldn't see the woman's face, the woman wouldn't see them. Well, but you know who the doctor is, so what the heck. But that's what was happening. But they were not trained in these maternal health care. The midwives were trained. American Medical Association wanted to control that knowledge that the midwives had in childbirth. These midwives were very smart people, and if you've done this for generations, you are pretty much aware of what it's about. Okay, if we don't catch up on the slide. Now, I said that their initial plan to eliminate the granny midwives didn't happen. They had to compromise. When they created that Shepherd-Towner Act, they placed it under the Federal Department of Labor. Okay, Federal Department wasn't going to administer any programs. So they handed that act down to the state and local officials and gave them the autonomy to structure the program the way they felt their state needed these benefits. They were matching benefits, but they handed that responsibility down to state and local government. So that's how we get down to Georgia. When they handed it down to state and local government, well, state and local government didn't know what to do with it. It was something new to them. But what came out of it was they created the public health departments. The public health departments came into existence because of the granny midwives. The responsibility of taking care of maternal health in the South became the responsibility of the health department under the auspices of a doctor and a hired nurse. The nurse supervised the midwives. Okay. As I said, that intent to eliminate the midwives didn't happen simply because they were not trained. And I kind of went over that. So since they had to compromise and train the granny midwives, then the midwives had to unlearn to learn what they were going to do. So with the granny midwives, there was an old way and a new way. The old way was the way that the granny midwives had functioned. knowing their skills, their ancestral skills. That was the old way. They used folk medicine. A lot of doctors said they were superstitious. And by superstitious, they did little things like if their patient was in labor and the pains became extensively long, they would place an axe under the bed, and it was believed to have cut the pain. Now, if you had any babies, I had two, you know it don't cut the pain. But, but they placed an axe, and it was more of a psychological thing. Or they would place open scissors under the pillow. The patient didn't know this was going on. They weren't supposed to know, but this is what they did. That was part of superstition. And then they had different rituals in terms of how they handled the placenta. The Granny Midwives called the placenta the tree of life. And it was because all of the blood vessels, everything that baby, that infant needed was in that placenta. That's where he got his nourishment. Even today, if you have a pregnant mother and she's not getting the nourishment that she needs, the baby is going to get it. Now, he might leave her depleted, but he's going to get his because it's coming through that placenta. Some of the midwives call the structure of the placenta biscuits, because if they looked and examined that placenta, they knew what was missing. And they knew that they needed to get that other part of that placenta out of their mother. Okay, those were the old ways. Now, the new ways was the ways that were set forth to them by the health department. Had to go through formal instruction, which was through, at that time, it was through Tuskegee Institute. That's where most of the Black women went for their instruction for midwives. They had training. There's a film called All My Babies. And there was also this book right here by Marie Campbell that was part of the training called Folks Do Get Born. She taught folklore at West Georgia College back in the 1950s. Okay. All right. They had to learn to do birth registrations. They had to fill out the forms. But they were also prohibited from doing a lot of things. Some of those things were inserting their hands into the birth canal. They could not do the internal examinations anymore. They had inspections on their person, on their midwife bags, and on their homes, and they could not carry their Bibles any longer. Remember, these were spiritual women. They couldn't carry the Bible any longer. So they had restrictions on that. They also had to apply for license to be able to deliver babies. That was an annual process. When I was doing my research here at the archives, I came across loads and loads of certification forms where these midwives had signed off and they had met their certifications and they had gotten their license all the way back to 1921. Fascinating archives over there. But all of that information was in there. So they had to learn all of these new things, had to forget the old stuff and learn the new. And for women who had not been to school, most of them was illiterate, that was a lot. That was a lot for them to do. But they had to learn it. So they couldn't do the internal examination. They couldn't practice turning that infant that was in the womb. It is said that Granny Midwives knew when a baby was in the wrong position by looking at their patient's stomach. And through massages, they could turn that baby. Nowadays, if the baby is in a breech position, guess what the hospital do? They take you up to the operating room, cut it out, suck it out, or pull it out. Whatever they felt was necessary, that's what they do. Strap you down on a metal table. If you're a first-time mother, it's frightening. You know, you don't know what's happening to your body already, and nobody's telling you. Granny Midwives would sit there with you. It took days. They would sit there, talk to you, read the Bible, and all this good stuff, make you comfortable. You go to the hospital, even today, and I know nowadays the hospital's kind of like a factory. You know, get in, get out, get in, get out. But the hospital was a cold, foreign place to these women, and it still is, especially now because there is a growing fear of hospitals and childbirth. Okay, but they could not, the Granny Midwives could not do these type of things that they were accustomed to doing to help their patient. They couldn't use the teas that they would give them to bring on labor. They could not have them chew on certain roots to help with the labor pains. They had to unlearn that. They had to put it to the side. They were not allowed to complete breech presentations. They were not allowed to deliver multiple births with twins. That was considered high risk. They were instructed not to deliver babies to patients who did not have a permission slip. The patient had to have a permission slip to deliver the babies as well. The doctor had to give them the permission slip to say, this midwife can deliver your baby. Okay. They were instructed to call the doctor at all times. Now, I read and did my research, and I have a granny midwife out of Alabama. Her name was Orny Lee Logan. In her autobiography, and I'm sure that she said this after she retired, but she said, call the doctor. See what she said about it? The doctor didn't care about Black women back then. You could call him, but that baby would be about 2 or 3 years old and up and walking before he got there. That. And a lot of it is true. Okay. But she was a sprightly lady. And she just said what came to her mind. All right. It's an interesting book. And if you have the time to either purchase it or read it, I would suggest you read it because it's good reading. And it's insightful. And it's not a dull moment in that book because she talks about her experiences. And some of them are just the experiences that midwives should know about. They had to attend monthly club meetings. That was each month. They would gather at a church or at the health center in the county where they lived. And they had these club meetings. During these club meetings, the health department nurse would, and I'm sorry, I keep moving around, but I need to stay in front of this microphone, so y'all forgive me. But anyway, these club meetings would be where these nurses would allow these granny midwives to organize their meetings in the way that they wanted to. So they would sing and they would pray, and then they would sing songs like nursery songs to teach these women how to be clean. For example, this is the way we wash our hands. Wash our hands, wash our hands. Okay. They did that. Now, for me, it would have been degrading. And just kind of like when COVID came, when you saw the commercial on TV telling you wash your hands for how many minutes? It's kind of like that. Also, in some of the information that I collected about Granny Midwives, there's a song here that they sang at a lot of their club meetings each month. Okay. They learned how to put silver nitrate in the infant eyes. And over there's a small bottle that was for the silver nitrate. It's dried up now because, it's been a while. But they use that. Graduation, if you remember back at the initial slide, there was Granny Midwives with all these black bags in front of them. At graduation, the state gave them the black bag. And it had all the equipment they needed. After they depleted that equipment, it was their responsibility to buy their own equipment then, but the state gave it to them. If the midwife retired, they had to give that bag back. Okay. So there was a list of contents that they had to carry in that bag. And they were inspected each month. Now, midwives were very clever, very clever. They knew that they had inspection coming. They knew that some of the instructions given by the health department was not working with their patient. So they prepared 2 bags. They had one bag that they prepared with all this health department approved equipment in, and they took it to be inspected at the Midwives Club. They prepared a second bag with all the herbs and teas in it, where they would take it with them to deliver a baby. And the health department had inspected these nurses that they needed to go on these trips with these midwives to make sure they were following all the rules. Well, there was too many babies. People were having babies. And if you got one nurse for a county, they can't do all of that. And the midwives know it. So they knew they were going to prepare that bag over here with what the health department said, and they knew they were going to prepare this bag over here, what was going to be beneficial to their patient, even though it was teas and herbs and stuff. They termed that particular action or that procedure a bag to show and a bag to go. Okay. They were very smart women. They had to think. They had to think. Also, during this time, the health department came down with a group or with a list of equipment that these women needed to take, needed to have prepared for their patients, even the patient, before they could deliver a baby. Those involved having a well-lit room, having a separate place for the baby to lay. You had so many different change of clothes for the baby, so many different change of clothes for the mother. You had to have diapers ready. It had to be a sanitized position. Now, Annie Lee, my favorite member, Ori Lee, my favorite midwife, she made the comment. How about that? She was a very wise woman. Like, how can you require somebody to have something when you ain't got nothing? And she made that statement. Now, I don't know if she made it while she was delivering midwives, but she surely made it in her autobiography. Okay. Those were requirements before birth. Now, when they required, the health department wanted to get rid of them. Remember, and I'm kind of watching my watch because I don't want to go over it because I want to give y'all question and answer time. But when I start talking about this, I just get all out of back with it. Yes. Anyway, when they wanted them to retire, they had taken the Bibles, but they let them sing and pray during the club meetings each month. When they wanted some of these older midwives, age 80, 90, some of them were 100, and when they wanted them to retire, remember they were spiritual women. They went and appealed to their church pastor to have a ceremony during the Sunday service. So I imagine that if you were Baptist, a Baptist minister may get up and say, well, Sister Smith, the Lord wants you to sit down and take your rest. You have labored in his vineyard, and he is well pleased with your service. A lot of these midwives accepted that, and they went on retired, hand their bags in. There were some of them that knew what the health department was up to. So a lot of times when they went to this service, prepared especially for them, when the minister would get up and relate these words to them, they would probably get up in the car because most of them on the motherboard. If you're in the Baptist church, you know what the motherboard is. It's that section over there where the older women sit. They would get up. She'd maybe sing a little song. And then she would say something like, well, been on my knees praying. And I've been praying and asking the good Lord what to do. And she would say something like, the good Lord ain't told me nothing like that yet. So that kind of squashed that. So I'm sure that the minister didn't know what to do. The public health nurse didn't know what to do. They probably just said that these women were not going to give up what they knew God had called them for. However, they found a way to get rid of them. They implemented the aged out rule, which means if you were age 65 or 70, you were out. Couldn't practice anymore. Okay. There were other efforts to squash the midwives. They were already looking at the maternal mortality rate. They were looking at them being superstitious. They was looking at them being ignorant and illiterate. They were looking at the cultural rituals, which they thought hedged on voodooism. Dr. Lee, who was a prominent physician with the American Medical Association, this is what he said of the Granny Midwives. He said the midwives is a relic of barbarianism. In civilized countries, the midwife is wrong, has always been wrong. The midwife has been a drag on the progress of the science and art of obstetrician. Her existence stunts the one and degrades the other. For many centuries, she perverted obstetrics from obtaining any standard at all among the science of medicine. And he's a medical doctor. Okay, now, Another quote that I found was by Dr. Joe Bolden. He was the Georgia Department of Hygiene, State Board of Health. This was back in 1950s. What he said was many of these midwives are over age 70. They're consequently feeble and cannot see as well as they should. The old and unclean and unfit should be gradually eliminated. This process of choosing the good from the bad will be a necessity, will necessarily be slow, and the local physician should assist in weeding out these women. Now, at a statewide meeting, a white politician, see, everybody was against these midwives, and these little old black ladies trying to do what God told them to do. But these high-level officials, a white politician said, well, really, he asked a question. What could a more pitiful picture than that of a prospective mother and a midwife, filthy and ignorant and not far removed from the jungles of Africa, laden with its atmosphere of weird superstitions and voodooism? Those were some of the comments that these black women had to put up with because they were against them. However, they needed them, so they became a necessary evil. They couldn't get rid of them, so they had to deal with them because if they feared that if they did not, it would not bring down the mortality rate. Okay, so the health department, the doctors, they were caught in between. Midwives received little pay for what they had to do, but like I said, they were genius. They carried, of course, 2 different bags. This is Maud Colin out of Virginia. Guess what she's doing? And you can't look at it and tell, but what she is doing, she has a box there, a cardboard box, and that box is for a premature baby. You see these little liquor bottles she's filling with water? This is hot water. When those babies were born and premature, she would fill those bottles with hot water, wrap them with towels, and put them around that baby to keep him warm so he would survive. They were smart women. Okay. And they did other things as well because they were just, God just made them that way. Okay. Now, I have other information and I don't want to prolong this because I do want you to have a question and answer session. So I will say fast forward to the day to our current time. Midwives have been faded out. They're starting to fade out. There are still midwives that practice, and some of them may be underground, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 demanded that public facilities be desegregated. That took place a lot of the responsibility of the midwives because they had to desegregate the hospitals, and Black women began going to the hospitals. You also had Medicaid, health insurance, government intervention. Midwives weren't paid under Medicaid, but the hospitals and the doctors were. Okay, so that added to the demise of the Granny Midwives. Here in Georgia today, there's a law in Georgia that says no person shall practice midwifery without first receiving from the Department of Human Resources a certificate of authority, but only the certified nurse midwives are eligible for those certificates. Georgia has no regulating board for midwives. Lay midwives, direct entry midwives are prohibited from administering medications. There are approximately 40 to 50, and this total may be a little off, but there are 40 to 50 practicing midwives in Georgia, and about 10 of them are certified professional midwives. In 1963, the state of Georgia stopped issuing license to midwives, to the lay midwives. Okay. Now, the last Granny Midwife to practice in Georgia was Aurelia Smiley on the left. She was a product of Miss B's house down in Camilla, Georgia. She delivered her last baby in 1986. Now, over in Carroll County, the last midwife to practice in Carroll County, Georgia was Miss Vera Strickland. She delivered her last infant in 1973. Now, when you saw the first slide, there were 8 midwives, but before 1973 and her being the last Granny Midwife, some of those midwives dropped out and a lot of them died. like Miss Wilson out of Villa Rica. She was a granny midwife, delivered over 2,000 babies. Okay. So now, before I go to question and answers, and I think we got a little bit, I want to relate to you that these uh, items that you see across this table, these are items that the granny midwives use. They're from a collection. And I also wanted to let you know that um, the last granny midwife, Vera Strickland, to practice in Carroll County was my grandma. So I know a lot about her. These are her items, and you can come up and look at them if you like, touch them, all of these. And this is not all of them. When she passed, my aunt received her collection. When my aunt passed, my mother got the collection. My mother passed, so I got it. So this is the part of my legacy. Okay, at this time, I want to open up for questions. Do you have any questions? Yes.
I think it was Louis Pasteur, who told the doctors who were going to deliver his wife's baby to wash their hands. They didn't.
And
the mother died
from an infection. A lot of the instruments that they were using, those forceps that they used to pull those babies out of those women, they were not sterilized. They used them on one patient, picked them up, used them on the next one, used them on the next one. So that's how you got those infections. Now, granny midwives could have done that. As a matter of fact, the maternal mortality rate decreased when those midwives were told to wash their hands, told to put these silver nitrate drops in these babies' eyes. All they had to do was tell them. These midwives were interested in bringing healthcare to their neighborhood, to their communities, because there was none. Okay. Thank you. I read that as well. I didn't know it was your wife, but I read that Pastor did instruct them to please wash their hands.
And I think that was as late as 1907.
Mm-hmm.
And you would have thought that the people would have learned about the germ theory before 1907.
Well, you know, they knew about it. They just didn't follow the rules. Because, of course, when you looked at this, mortality rate is still up. It was high in 1921 and it's high in 2023. It hasn't changed. There was one period in history where the maternal mortality rate was low. But for African American women, their rate was never lower than the rate for white women, and it was never lower than the overall state rate. It was always higher. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. By my grandma. By my grandma. My mom had 11 children, and she delivered every one of them. As a matter of fact, my grandmom is credited to delivering 20 family members. Yeah, her name is on my birth certificate. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. All right. You know, it's a lot of us in here that was birthed by midwife. Okay. The person that made that statement, did you have any other comment? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Way to determine what the mortality rate is then for African Americans versus now, and by comparison to white women.
Okay. Now, when they implemented the Shepherd-Towner Act, Georgia or not any of the other southern states were tracking mortality rate. They began tracking it when they implement this act. All of the states did not track it. Georgia did not start tracking it until 1925. Now, the act came about in 1921. So some of the rates were not tracked immediately, even though it was mandated that they should do that. And when they began tracking it, a lot of it did not include African American women. Say over in Alabama, they did not start tracking it until after 1925. And they did not secure or present adequate tracking. So a lot of the information that are there, it may not be accurate. the CDC has a database that has it, but then that's based on what these health departments was telling CDC. Now, CDC, I understand, is tracking it now. So there is a distinction between the races, and it's tracked by state.
Question. So we start the beginning of the 20th century, the high for infant mortality.
Mhm.
We end the 20th century with the high infant mortality.
Mhm.
In between, we have midwifery,
Mhm.
midwifery, and we have public health.
Mhm.
Great stage the same.
Mhm.
So you've done so much, and it's a beautiful presentation and lots of information. But I'm just trying to get the takeaway as to on the issue of mortality.
Mhm.
Does midwifery has it been a help in the issue,
Mhm.
or has public health been a help in the issue?
Mhm.
What's your sense on it?
Public health has been a benefit, especially for African Americans, because it established a healthcare system for them. Remember, before that, they didn't have it.
It didn't bring down the rate.
At some point, it did, but it went back up. It went back up. And when it went back up, the doctors were delivering the majority of the babies, just like they are now. So it was a benefit for African American women. Right now, there is an upsurge in the demand for midwifery deliveries. Black women are afraid of hospitals. And Georgia, I credit them for bringing the attention of the maternal mortality rate to the nation, because for 10 years it was Georgia. They were doing studies in Georgia, and no other state was mentioned. But most recently, you are getting states like Alabama, Tennessee, Texas that has rates not as high as Georgia and Louisiana, but they are looking at those rates. And I credit a lot of the political activity to it, because you've got Black women that sitting in political positions that can bring attention to that. Any other? I'll get you. And did you have a question? I think I saw his hand first. Okay.
Okay. Do you ever watch Call the Midwife?
I did not watch that, but I know about it. And I keep telling myself I'm going to do a binge on it.
Because I think a lot of that is very, very useful
And relevant.
and relevant.
Yeah.
And then also on Downton Abbey,
Mm-hmm.
Sybil died during childbirth or after childbirth. So those Brit produced things address the midwife, and also the controversy between the two doctors over Sybil's death.
Yeah, even though they have these TV shows, these series, they are based on history. So you find a lot of history in them. So yeah, I looked at the Dalton area. Mm-hmm. It is being pushed because there's an upsurge. And also you might want to think that when Atlanta Medical Center down here closed out, that was one of two centers that provided natural childbirth. And now the only one that provided is Emory's clinic here in Midtown. And I think it only has 18 beds. So midwifery is on an upsurge. There is a demand. And there is legislature last year at the state capitol. I don't think they dealt with it because, they deal with a whole lot of stuff and they don't deal with some of the most important stuff. But I think it died. And of course, when COVID came, that kind of shut down a lot of stuff. But there's an upsurge, and hopefully they would do something about it. you're making me say this. I think it's not going to happen until we look at the incidence of institutionalized racism. Okay, when you look at maternal rates of white women that have decreased, you say have the same medical opportunities, Medicaid providing for that, and you still get a higher rate. It ain't the medical. It's some of them. You do have doctors that believe that blacks can withstand pain a whole lot more than whites. But I think you have to deal with the racism behind it and the disparities in the healthcare system. And I think even though you have study after study after study, you're not going to get to the roots of it until you deal with that big old R that's standing out there in front of your face. The highest rate. So you have to, thank you. So you have to stop looking so much at labeling what it is and deal with what's behind all of it. And let's just be honest, we got to deal with racism and the disparities there. There, I said it. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Now, Granny Midwives were not paid a lot. Sometimes they did work for free. My grandma, and this is a page out of her personal records, and I don't know if she lists her pay in here, but from what I can understand and what my mother has told me, she would take from $2, $5, $10. Now, there came a time when they had to start paying midwives up to $50. And when they started mandating that midwives be paid, then the American Medical Association stepped in and wanted the doctors to do it rather than the midwives. But if they did not get monetary pay, a lot of these wives did it for free, or their patient would give them a chicken. They may even go and help them cultivate their spring gardens. So they did not get a pay for a lot of the things they did. They just did it because they felt that God gave them that knowledge, and they repaid it by helping the underprivileged people who could not provide health care for themselves. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Here in Georgia, it is encouraged. Remember, I put the slide up about the regulations. It is encouraged that you become a certified midwife. Now, there are Black organizations like NAM, the National African American Association. I can remember what the name is, but there are organizations. And if you would give me your email or your phone, I will give you a list of those organizations. But most of the time, that training is sponsored by a medical entity. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Or at that time in history, was the state of Georgia more advanced medically than Alabama?
They were about the same. They were in the South. Remember, the South were an area that was kind of backwards, and they were kind of in the same boat. But what had happened was Georgia took more interest in it than Alabama did. They went on at Georgia has some very good records. Alabama does not, and they started looking at ways that they could help this population. Over in Alabama, where Black people were ill, they didn't have a lot of facilities. A lot of them that were African American owned closed down because of economic reasons. And the best place that they could get to was Tuskegee. And if you come in from Mobile all the way to Macon County, Alabama, that's a long trek. But a lot of midwives would take their difficult patients there. And the John A. Andrews Clinic opened in 1940s, where they trained nurse midwives, where they could go out and become facilitators and supervise Black midwives. But Alabama was a little slow in catching on to the health care problems. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, just a comment. I was delivered by a midwife in the mid-40s. And you mentioned your midwife's, your grandmother's name was on your birth certificate. Yeah, my birth certificate came from the federal government as opposed to Georgia. Was that typical in Georgia or just the Atlanta?
It was typical in Georgia. It was Alabama, southern states. They were trained to fill out the birth registrations. And right, and they had to actually put the person who delivered you on that certificate. Now, what happened, a lot of the doctors did not list themselves on those certificates because a lot of times those patients died and they didn't want to go through the scrutiny because at one time they implicated an investigation department to investigate the deaths of these women. Any other questions? I thank you very much. I hope that it was enlightening. I certainly learned a lot, and I added any session that I do, I learn a lot from my audience, and I am so happy because I learned a lot too. So I thank you.
So yeah, no, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah. So everybody, thank you to Miss Ruby for coming and giving her presentation today. Before we leave, I know it's a little after 1, but just want to give you some updates on some of the things happening here at the archives. Our next Lunch and Learn in September is September 8th. It'll be There Is My Country, Georgians Who Followed the Sun by Roger Byrd, who is an associate professor of social sciences at Bruton Parker College. And then while you're here today, if you have time, we have our church exhibits going on downstairs. So please feel free to stop by and take a look at that. And then we do have our date for our Archives and Genealogy Day event. That's October 7th. We're still developing the program for that, but we'll put updates on our Facebook page and on the georgiaarchives.org website too. And then we will post Miss Ruby's presentation on our YouTube channel. So feel free to take a look at that when we post that next week. And you can always look at our previous Lunch and Learns listed on that website as well. So again, I just wanted to say thank you guys for coming. Please feel free to come up and take a look at some of the items that Miss Ruby has brought with her, and feel free to stay and chat. So thank you guys for coming.